later slot because of the timescales and the need to get back to Belfast tonight. So I'm Quintin and I'm going to talk a little bit more about referendums, having been sparked by the fantastic discussion earlier from Richard and Najati onto very similar but very different outings in recent months. I'm going to give 3 laws of referendums and then suggest 3 heresies that we might discuss. Firstly, interestingly, in the earlier question and answer, there was an assumption that most referendums pass. That's actually not statistically true. Most referendums are lost, and governments who think they can propose a referendum and win it should certainly think again, because the data is against them. It's very narrow, it's just over 50% in that case. The 3 laws. The first is that voters tend to answer the wrong question. That's what Charles de Gaulle decided after using the referendum to good effect until the end of his career. And then he said the trouble is that the voters answer the wrong question because they're motivated by different things at that moment. For example, the Netherlands, early in 2016, the year we call the year of terrible referendums, the Netherlands voted on a trade agreement between the EU and the Ukraine. Now, EU and Ukraine trade is an important issue. The Netherlands have to have a referendum on it because of constitutional requirements. The trade between the Netherlands and Ukraine is tiny. The voters weren't particularly debating that issue, and the question they answered was, do we like our current government? No, they didn't, it turned out. So, very clearly, the risk of holding a referendum is that your voters will not respond so simply. The end of 2016 saw another classic example when Prime Minister Renzi took his country, Italy, to a referendum on constitutional reform. And it was Rick Ritter, who's just re-entered the room, who taught me a very good question in the early 2000s. Do the voters really get up and over the family breakfast discuss whatever the topic was? So did the Italian voters get up and discuss electoral reform and constitutional reform and the role of the Senate and weighted majorities in the Senate over breakfast? Probably not, as Prime Minister Renzi found to his cost, as they voted against his proposals, probably answering a different question on the economy. And it's arguable about the Brexit question whether the UK voters were answering that question. And one thing Richard didn't have time to explore was the different parts of the UK, which is counted as one unit, but with substantial devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Those areas and their relationship to the central state caused some particular difficulties that caused voters there to answer slightly different questions. Second law is that referendums are not elections, and yet political parties still fight them as if they were elections. And the classic case there was Colombia, October 2016, when President Manuel Santos could not resist refighting the 2014 presidential election against his nemesis, President Uribe, and the voting patterns, if you overlay them, of the 2014 presidential and the 2016 referendum are almost identical. And there, the voters didn't seem to be answering the question, do you want rid of the FARC, the most successful narco-terrorist organization in the world for the last 50 years, which everyone did, but they seemed to be voting again in that presidential election. And the narrowness of that case on a very low turnout, and we have a good discussion on turnout as well, and the impact of turnout on referendums, was the turnout was 37%, and it was 54,000 votes out of 13 million votes that decided the Colombian referendum for no. And interestingly, Santos's response wasn't to rerun the referendum. It was to say, let's not rerun it, but let's bring in the parties, let's bring in the no voters and their leadership, let's bring in the FARC, and let's see if we can negotiate some of the worst edges off of it. Now, that's interesting democratically. You could argue good for the peace process, but one could argue about its status in supporting the rule of law, the rule of the referendum, and the sanctity of the voter. Likewise, you could argue that the Turkish one from Necati's presentation earlier was Erdogan trying to re-win the election, and I thought the party loyalty in the votes was an interesting slide that one should study in all referendums, is how loyal are parties, voters or not. Third law is, it's the economy stupid, but no it's not. Sometimes the economy, and you could argue that the Thai referendum last year on military rule was about a strong and stable government because it would more likely deliver us a stronger economy. You could argue the Netherlands was rejecting the EU-Ukraine trade deal because voters were concerned about the poor economy and wanted the government to concentrate it. But Scotland 2014, you could say, could have been won by more than 55-45 because voters were voting culturally, they were voting about identity in Scotland, and therefore were prepared to take the risk of a poorer economy, at least in the short term, possibly in the long term, for the national identity boost. And we can look at Cyprus too, where you could argue that the reunification of the island would undoubtedly boost the economy in terms of scale and access to new markets. And yet, because of the 50 years of frozen conflict, voters are not able to articulate and touch the increased economic benefit. It's not real, it's not instant enough for them to shift their votes in 2004. Three heresies. Firstly, we used to say that pre-negotiation referendums were sometimes appropriate. The best example of that is de Klerk's last all-white vote in South Africa in 1992, when he sought a mandate to go into negotiations with the ANC to negotiate the end of apartheid, and then he never went back for a second one on the post-deal. Scotland, you could say, was pre-negotiation because the terms of Scotland's independence from the UK had not been negotiated, and therefore it was all wild speculation about whether milk and honey and whisky would flow from the taps of Scotland rather than detail. And Brexit was certainly pre-negotiation in the big sense, as we're now going into the negotiations, but Cameron tried to pitch it as post-negotiation. Remember, he went around the European capitals trying to get concessions, but didn't really succeed there. But post-negotiation referendums can be really successful at sealing deals, particularly in conflict situations. So our one in Northern Ireland in 1998 was one of the world-leading examples of the popular vote sealing the negotiation by political parties in a contested and divided society. The second heresy is about direct democracy. Because while we all have a nod to it, it raises lots of difficulties, certainly in the populism debate that we've had in the last 36 hours, in terms of the narrowness of victories. I'm not sure you're right about most votes being within the 55-45 range, and lots were in the 90s, 80s and 70s, lots of recent ones as well. The APP vote, alternative vote in the UK was beaten by 2 to 1. And a lot of other votes are. But since we're so much better at deliberative and participative democracy now, in terms of the tools we have to consult and engage citizens, is the binary vote of a referendum, which is only eligible to those who are on the register, and most countries now have difficulties with having accurate electoral registers, and only those over a certain age. So in Scotland, they reduced the age to 16 to include 16 to 18-year-olds. Most other places have 18 plus. But the question there is, what about children? Do younger people not have rights to participate in democracy? You may put a bar on the voting age, but that actually excludes people. And as we see in referendums across Europe, lots of different exclusions depending on what country you're in, what level of election it is. And finally, the conditionality question that I raised earlier, which I think is now worthy of further discussion. And I know it's a heresy, because democracy is about 50% plus one, but in our golf clubs, in our sporting associations, the Constitution will often say a 2/3 majority. And in many cases, referendums have conditionality. The Hungarian referendum by Orbán in July 2016 about European migration rules was not passed because of the conditionality there. My final lovely quote, which is why I want to get back to Cyprus, whose peace talks are now faltering again, and they may not get to their referendum this year or next, which I have on my wall in my office, where the headline in the local newspaper was, "Archbishop says yes voters will go to hell."